The CIA is constantly pushing the envelope of legality, and they just wait for somebody to push back. And the reason why the Russians haven't agreed to substantive talks brokered by Donald Trump is that they're winning, so that it is now legal for the American government to propagandize the American people. Every one of them has seen something, some ship. Sometimes they're coming out of the water. That I probably shouldn't comment on.
Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm here today with John Kiriakou, a quite well-known CIA whistleblower, and I'd like to start today's interview by welcoming John and asking him if he could give a quick introduction for those who might not be familiar with his work.
Sure, I'm John Kiriakou. I spent almost 15 years at the CIA. I was the chief of the CIA's counterterrorism operations in Pakistan after 9/11. I blew the whistle on the CIA's torture program in 2007. Later went to the private sector, and then after that was the chief investigator on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Now I'm a journalist, author, commentator, talk show host, bunch of different things.
Perhaps what you're most well known for, especially in recent months on the internet, it seems, is your initial whistleblowing over the torture program or the enhanced interrogation program, as they called it. It seems that this was the final straw for you. Could you explain to people what was occurring and why you felt you had to speak out?
Yeah, the CIA had decided to torture its prisoners after 9/11. Plain and simple. And torture is illegal. By any measure, it's illegal. We have the Federal Torture Act of 1946. We have the United Nations Convention Against Torture. The lawyers at the Justice Department stood on their heads to somehow make it not illegal. I disagreed with that and decided to go public.
I work under Clive Stafford Smith. I think I might have mentioned that. And he sometimes talks about some of his clients who are in Gitmo and some of the torture methods that were used on them. Do you find any of the methods used particularly troubling?
Of the
Enhanced
American,
interrogation?
yeah, most of them I found to be particularly troubling. Uh, in fact, rather than list these things, I'll tell you that in 1946 we executed Japanese soldiers who had waterboarded American prisoners of war. In 1968, we successfully prosecuted a soldier, an American soldier, for waterboarding a North Vietnamese prisoner. He was given 20 years in prison. So this went from a death penalty case to 20 years in prison to all of a sudden, like magic, just being suddenly legal in in 2002. The law never changed. We changed. And my position was if you want to torture people, that's on you, but you're going to have to change the law because the law is very clear.
Much of the torture programs and these wrongdoings were a response to 9/11, or at least they were framed that
Yes.
way. In how would you say they should have responded to 9/11?
Oh, by hunting down those who had perpetrated 9/11 and bringing them to justice. And when I say justice, I don't mean with a bullet to the head or with, a life without parole at Guantanamo, despite never having been convicted of a crime. What you do is what the Constitution tells you to do, and that is to allow them to face a jury of their peers in a federal court. If our contention was that the Al Qaeda leadership and Al Qaeda fighters were violating US law, then charge them with a crime and put them on trial. It really was as simple as that.
It seems that a lot of the things that happen within the CIA are quite compartmentalized. Do you think that in terms of individual officers, there wasn't a large awareness of the interrogation methods that were being used.
There was not. When I was first told about the torture program, there were fewer than 2 dozen people in all of the entire American government who knew about it.
Wow. So it seemed it was from the top, really.
Oh, it came directly from the top, yes.
I want to ask a little bit about how you feel about the CIA now. Do you think that this was a unique example of, I suppose, incompetency, or do you think that they generally have issues like this across the board, many of which the public may not be aware of?
Oh, yeah, it wasn't incompetency. In fact, they were very competent in the way they carried out a torture program. It was that the CIA is constantly pushing the envelope of legality, and they just wait for somebody to push back. The problem is that the congressional oversight committees, which are supposed to be the bodies that do push back, really act as little more than cheerleaders for the CIA, egging them on. Think of it this way. The torture program was created from the top of the CIA. The director of the CIA, George Tenet, ordered its creation. But it was authorized and it was funded by the congressional oversight committees. So these protestations later that members of Congress had no idea that this program was taking place, that was just a lie. They were just lying to their constituents and to the American people. Not only did they know that the torture program was taking place, they had authorized it and they had appropriated funds to fund it.
I know you've mentioned before that even the president signed off on some of the wrongdoing of the CIA. How much autonomy does the CIA have, though? Does it have power above and over the presidency?
No, no,
Okay,
it doesn't.
okay.
And
Um,
at the end of the day, the president had signed off on everything that the CIA
mhm,
was doing. They did nothing without executive approval, nothing, because then you
okay.
risk being prosecuted.
Mhm. Back to I briefly mentioned 9/11, and I've heard you respond to this before, but where were you on the day of 9/11, and how did you respond to that situation?
Yeah, I was at CIA headquarters. I had a 9 o'clock meeting planned with the director of counterterrorism at the White House. We were going to see Condoleezza Rice, who was the national security advisor. And I got a call from the driver saying that the car was ready to take us to the White House. Went up to his office to tell him it was time to go, and saw on his secretary's television that the World Trade Center, one tower was burning. I asked her what happened. She told me a plane had flown into it. And then the second plane flew into Tower One. And then it started that nightmare, that 25-year long nightmare now just began as easily as that.
And what do you think fueled the response to 9/11? Do you think it was primarily fueled by fear or anger or
Yes, and yes, and a desire for revenge. Yes. This was the greatest intelligence failure in the history of the Republic. And
Mhm.
so, 3,000 Americans lost their lives that day, that one day, because we didn't do our jobs. And so there was this great desire to extract revenge.
Yes,
It was
yes.
overwhelming.
You mentioned that it's a intelligence failure, a major intelligence failure. Do you also think that there was um, an element of this can be attributed to policy failure?
Absolutely. I say all the time too that it wasn't just an intelligence failure, it was an American failure. The CIA failed, obviously. The FBI also failed because the FBI knew that the hijackers were loose in the United States. The State Department failed because none of those hijackers were here illegally. They went through the visa application process and they were granted visas by the State Department. Congress failed to appropriate enough counterterrorism funding to really lock the place down. It was a failure across the board. The Federal Aviation Administration failed because security at the airports wasn't appropriate. to the point where 19 people boarded airplanes that day with box cutters in their pockets. How in the world did that happen?
And looking back, do you think that there were warning signs that were missed before 9/11? I mean, it's led to millions of innocent people being killed in Iraq and other areas of the Middle East. Do you think that there were warning signs that should have been noticed before 9/11 occurred?
I'm not sure I would call it so much a warning sign as I would a deliberate policy. Um, what what made these Al Qaeda people hate us so much that they just wanted to carry out the wholesale slaughter of Americans? It was U.S. foreign policy. That's what they were objecting to. And we've never undertaken a review of our foreign policy.
Back a little bit to your choice to come out and be a whistleblower. In what ways were people like you and others marginalized within the CIA? I mean, I know you were later imprisoned, but were there other ways in which you were marginalized?
No, when I resigned from the CIA, I was at the very top of my game. I resigned because I got divorced and I wanted to spend more time with my children. So I was never marginalized. The last job I had at headquarters was as the executive assistant to the CIA's deputy director for operations. So my career was on a rocket ride to the top. Um, I was never marginalized.
Okay. So would you mind going in to a little bit more detail on when you spoke out and then later you were investigated and subsequently imprisoned? Could you explain these events?
Yeah, I thought certainly that somebody would go public with the CIA's torture program because there were so many people internally who were opposed to it. Opposed to the point where they were resigning, they were curtailing their positions and coming back from the secret prison site. And I thought certainly somebody was going to say something, and then nobody did. And then finally, in December of 2007, at the urging of Brian Ross of ABC News, I went public and said something. The Bush administration investigated me for a year from December of 2007 until December of 2008, and then decided that I had not committed a crime and then closed the case. Barack Obama became president a month later. John Brennan became his deputy national security advisor for counterterrorism. He asked the attorney general to secretly reopen the case against me. They investigated me for 3 more years and then charged me with 5 felonies in January of 2012, a little more than 4 years after I had gone public.
And how long did you spend in prison?
23 months.
What was that experience like? I mean, being imprisoned for essentially no real wrongdoing. How did you deal with that situation?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer because on the one hand you're in shock, you can't believe this has happened. On the other hand, you have to get a hold of your bearings. I wrote a book about the experience that actually won 2 literary awards. It's called Doing Time Like a Spy: How the CIA Taught Me to Survive and Thrive in Prison. And it's done well enough that the publisher just came out with a second edition a month ago. But I decided that I was trained for this, that I was going to use the life lessons that the CIA taught me to keep myself safe. And at the top of the social heap, I would forge strategic alliances in prison. And honestly, by the end of it, I felt like I was practically running the place.
Hmm. Okay, that's interesting. So your CIA skills helped you be.
I told myself I had lived and served in far worse places than Loretto, Pennsylvania. And so I was going to just take the bull by the horns and manage it. And that's what I
Mhm.
did.
You mentioned as well just a moment ago that you were surprised others didn't speak out about the enhanced interrogation methods. I've also heard you in other interviews discuss the fact that CIA officers may have a certain personality type. Could you explain whether maybe you think that it's because of this personality type that there was a lot of silence and complacency within the program?
Yeah, what you're talking about is the CIA's policy of hiring people who have sociopathic tendencies, not sociopaths, but people who have sociopathic tendencies are willing to work in moral, legal, and ethical gray areas. I think, though, that the reason people who were even opposed to the torture program didn't say anything was not because they had sociopathic tendencies, but because they feared for their job security. One of my attorneys said something to me that made perfect sense. He said, "This case is so much bigger than John Kiriakou. This case is about making an example so that if anybody else in the CIA is thinking about going public and reporting wrongdoing, they're going to see what happened to you. You lost your pension, you lost your freedom, you lost your family, you lost everything. Are people going to really want to take that risk?" And the
Mhm.
answer is no.
I suppose a lot of people might view espionage as a way of protecting national security. Do you think that it's more often than not, or at least in a lot of cases, used merely to silence embarrassment?
That's a very good question. Um, yes, I do, actually. There's a law in this country, and this is why the Bush administration declined to prosecute me. There's a law that says that it is illegal to classify a criminal act. And torture, the FBI said, was a criminal act. And so you can't prosecute me because I revealed a crime.
Hmm.
Well, the Obama administration said it wasn't torture, and thus it wasn't a criminal act. And so my revelations were violations of the Espionage Act. They ended up dropping all the espionage charges against me. I hadn't committed espionage, and they knew it. But but yeah, to answer your question, I think a lot of what we see coming out of the CIA in terms of classification is an effort just to protect the agency. Sure.
And after these experiences, after your time in the CIA and then subsequently your treatment, are you rather cynical towards the powers that be,
Yes,
or
I am. It's been my considered experience, my personal experience, that most of our leaders are lying, right? They don't have any interest at all in exposing the truth or perpetuating truths.
Mhm.
They see their job as carrying out the policies of whomever happens to be in the White House and doing so clandestinely and doing so despite the fact that it may, be a violation of the law, and anyone who tries to stand in their way should be destroyed.
And
That's
it's
really what the
inter
bottom line is.
mhm. And it's interesting because the UK, the US, they claim to be democracies.
Right.
And that's an interesting point as well that links on from this is whether the CIA in its activities that the public aren't made aware of is undermining democracy.
And
What would
I,
you have
I,
to
I
say?
would go even further than that. The British government is even tougher on whistleblowers than the American government is. We don't have an official secrets act like you do. And we don't have a terrorism act like you do. So if I were, in the UK and I said that I support Palestinian human rights, I could be prosecuted just for saying that. I could be stopped at the airport and told that while I'm not under arrest, I'm also not free to go. I have three friends, one of whom is a former British ambassador, who have been stopped at the airport and threatened with arrest under the Terrorism Act or the Official Secrets Act. It's draconian in the UK.
hmm
At least in the US, you have a fighting chance with the Espionage Act. Not so in the UK. It's much tougher,
I mean, we've seen this as well with the terrorism act, recently with a certain protest group in alignment with Palestine and
right?
the government designating them as a terrorist group, to then arrest harmless protesters in the street. So I suppose there's
Yeah.
issues with.
Yeah, and in the United States, there are individual states that are trying to enact similar legislation or legislation that is similar to what the UK has. In the state of Florida now, and this won't last very long because it'll be successfully challenged in the courts, but it is illegal to go onto a social media platform and express support for Palestinians. To the point where I happened to be in Miami 2 weeks ago and a woman wrote on Facebook that she supported uh, Palestinian human rights. And sure enough, the Miami police knocked on her door the next day and demanded that she explain herself. She closed the door and they walked away. They didn't arrest her. But when an arrest comes, and it will, that law is going to be thrown out. So there is
Mhm.
this move in support of you know squelching free speech and any challenges to Israel at all. It's as though, Benjamin Netanyahu is president of the United States right now.
I'd like to go to a slightly different, well, a very different topic, which is the idea of targeted killings or assassinations carried out by the CIA. Could you explain the dynamics of these activities and how the CIA behaves in these areas?
Yeah, the CIA has a unit. Actually, there are several units whose job it is to simply travel around the world as needed and carry out assassinations. Uh, if the president deems a person to be what is called a clear and present danger to the United States, to American citizens, or American installations, they can be killed according to US law. And so these teams fan out each week. They carry out their assassinations. And then the next week, they get the next list of names and then just do the same thing week after week after week.
I suppose the obvious question, and perhaps it's not possible to answer um, with any certainty, but are there regular cases of wrongful executions, I suppose, cases where people are killed?
I would say there have to be. There would have to be. Keep in mind, none of these people have ever been charged with a crime, so we don't even know what it is they're supposed to have done. And I will add that since the Obama administration, the position of the Justice Department has been that the president has the legal authority to order the assassinations of American citizens who have never been charged with a crime. If the president decides that this person is dangerous, the president can legally order that that person be assassinated.
Purely out of interest, do you know if a similar program exists in the UK?
No idea.
Okay.
But you know what? If it did, it would be so highly classified that almost nobody would know about it. My guess is that there is no similar program. And I'll tell you what I base that on. I'm friendly with a handful of retired MI6 officers, and they have told me independently of one another how disappointed they were in the United States after 9/11 because the CIA just started killing everybody. And that's something that MI6 just wasn't doing.
hmm But I think possibly there's a common occurrence where people who aren't from the United States underestimate the impact that 9/11 had on people, especially in New York and
Without a doubt.
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay, well, I want to move on a little bit again to some geopolitics, particularly the Russia-Ukraine war.
Mhm.
So,
Today's the fourth anniversary.
yes, well, it seems to be never ending. It doesn't seem like there's too much of a working towards peace. But how do you view the war and NATO's role in perhaps poking the bear? Um, how do you view this situation and how the war came about?
I believe the war really originated in 2014, not in 2022. The United States had repeatedly promised the Russians that NATO would not expand to Russia's borders. And then we did exactly that. We expanded right up to Russia's borders. And we promised the Russians repeatedly that Ukraine would not become a part of NATO. And then we announced that we were going to start talks with Ukraine to become a part of NATO. So we lied repeatedly to the Russians. The Russians twice asked to join NATO themselves. And twice, under President Bill Clinton and under President Barack Obama, we told the Russians that was not going to happen. Can you imagine how different the world would be today if the
Hmm.
Russians were a part of NATO? Well, in 2014, we deposed a prime minister, a democratically elected prime minister of Ukraine who happened to be pro-Russian. And we replaced him with a pro-American, pro-Western prime minister. The Russians saw this as a direct challenge. And so they snatched Crimea. For their own protection, they snatched Crimea. And then elected and said that he wanted to not only uh, begin accession talks for Ukraine to become a member of the European Union, he announced publicly that he wanted to join NATO. And the Russians had had enough. And the reason why this thing is still dragging on, the reason why the Russians haven't agreed to substantive talks brokered by Donald Trump, is that they're winning. And there's no reason for them to engage in talks because they're winning. The bottom line is that Ukraine at the end of this is going to be a rump state. It might even be a landlocked state, and it will never be in NATO. But the Russians are trying to put as much hurt on the Ukrainians as they possibly can. And there's nothing that the United States or NATO can do to stop them.
So why do you think it almost seems as if NATO and the United States and these Western countries wanted to cause a conflict, such as the conflict that's now occurring? Why is it in their interest to have this conflict going on at the moment?
Because a weak Russia is always in the national interests of the Western countries, just like a bankrupt China would be in the national interest of, the United States and the Western countries. Because if you keep Russia weak, that makes the European Union and NATO and the United States strong. It really is that simple.
And do you view, I mean, in the UK, the media is incredibly biased, the mainstream media. Do you think that Russia are as much of a threat as the media makes out, or a threat at all to the West?
Yeah, I don't have rose-colored glasses. Um, I think that, sure, the Russians are going to be a threat. Yes, the Russians kill their political opponents, whether domestically or overseas. We've seen that play out in the UK. We've seen it play out all across Russia. But at the same time, I don't believe that the Russians are an existential threat to the West. I really don't. I think that Russia has been very badly mishandled by especially the US and the UK. And we have missed several opportunities to bring Russia into the Western fold. And now Russia will never be in the Western fold. We're going to be in a state of war with Russia for a very long time, even if it's not a hot war, even if it's another Cold War, which is a shame because I think that when the Soviet Union fell apart, we really did have an opportunity to change the global landscape, and we just let it go.
Another country that the West often vilifies is China. You just mentioned. How do you view China as an international threat? We've recently had um, the Chinese embassy controversy. How do you view that in particular, and also China's broader influence and role?
China, in my view, China really is the threat to the West. Not because the Chinese are bad people, but because the Chinese economy is so strong and the Chinese are so flush with cash that they've essentially been able to buy friends all around the world. There's this ongoing joke here in the United States. Why can't we have nice roads and nice airports and nice bridges and nice hospitals and bullet trains? How come the Chinese have all those things? Well, it's because we spend $1 trillion a year on weapons and the Chinese don't. I spoke with a Congolese diplomat one time, and he made a statement that was so simple and so powerful. He said, "You promise us democracy. The Chinese promise us food." And there's a big difference. You can't
Hmm.
eat democracy.
Yeah.
So the only thing that has saved us, I think, so far is the Chinese through history have not really been an imperialist, expansionist country. We can have a conversation about Tibet.
Hmm.
But Tibet aside, the Chinese don't normally invade other countries. Certainly we fought the Chinese in Korea. They have had border skirmishes with the Indians and with the Vietnamese, but the Chinese don't actively invade other countries like the United States does. The Chinese have one foreign military. Ironically, they share with the United States in Djibouti, in the Horn of Africa. The Chinese, as enormous as the Chinese government and military are, they have one aircraft carrier. One. We have 24 aircraft carriers. Now, half of them are not seaworthy, but we have a lot more aircraft carriers than the Chinese do.
Hmm.
And so I'm not worried about Chinese military expansion so much as I'm worried about Chinese economic expansion. There's a satirical newspaper here in the United States called The Onion, and they had a headline last week, and the headline was Chinese content to sit back and watch US destroy itself. And the reason why that's funny is that it's true.
Yes. Yeah. So they're not the military threat that other nations perhaps throughout history have been, but they've got the ability to dominate economically.
Yes. Yes,
Okay,
indeed.
okay. Well, before moving on to the last of the sort of geopolitical issues, which I'm sure you can guess what that will be, I've got a few broader questions about media and narrative. Um, so often the UK at least seems to portray Russia and China and these Eastern countries as purveying disinformation and disinformation being a primarily foreign thing. Do you think that we're fooled if we think that the UK and other Western countries aren't also engaged in similar disinformation?
Oh, yeah. Of course, we're engaged in similar disinformation to the point where here in the United States, during the Obama administration in 2014, we changed the law so that it is now legal for the American government to propagandize the American people. So, of course, we're out there engaging in disinformation without any question.
Do you think that do you know if journalists are used as instruments in intelligence battles or used by intelligence agencies?
Without any question. And we know that thanks to the Freedom of Information Act. We know that the CIA will threaten journalists with cutting off their access, not inviting them to the CIA Christmas party anymore, threatening them if they publish certain articles. There are major American journalists at the biggest outlets in the country who will send their articles to the CIA for clearance before they send them to their own editors. So yeah, I feel like the CIA has a stranglehold on intelligence reporting here in the United States.
And I would assume you think that that's very problematic.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Part of the problem is that American outlets, news outlets, especially in print journalism, just simply no longer have budgets for investigative journalism. And where you have the likes of the Washington Post and the New York Times that literally brought down a president in Richard Nixon, they now just don't have investigative journalism.
Hmm. Okay. I mean, I think we could spend more time on that topic, but I think the Israel issue is going to be a big one as well. So I'll move on to that. Firstly, I'll ask you about the genocide, or I don't know if you recognize it as a genocide, but
Ooh,
Israel's military actions.
yeah, it's a genocide, all right, by any definition.
Mhm. So what do you feel about the situation that's occurring in Israel and Gaza, and even after the ceasefire, the deaths that have been occurring and the
Yeah.
civilian to military casualty proportions? How do you feel about this situation, and why do you think that the West, and particularly the US, is so complacent in their response?
I feel that this is a genocide. I think it's very clear that it's a genocide. It meets every definition of a genocide, including ethnic cleansing. Um, I don't believe there has been a ceasefire because the Israelis have continued to kill Palestinian civilians quite literally every single day since the so-called ceasefire was initiated. And and I think the reason why the United States, I hesitate to use the word complacent because complacency implies disinterest.
Mhm.
I'm going to say I think the reason why the US is a part of this and it's on the side of the Israelis and Israeli actions in both Gaza and the West Bank is that the pro-Israel lobby in the United States is so strong that almost no one has the guts to stand up to Israel. There are Israeli lobbyists in literally every single one of the 535 members of Congress on Capitol Hill. There are Israeli lobbyists in literally every single one of the 50 state legislatures. And now we have Israeli lobbyists lobbying at the local level. Why? Why
Mhm.
do Israelis care about the outcome of American school board races? Or who gets elected mayor of what town? Or who gets elected to some little teeny tiny district in Kansas or Arizona? It doesn't make sense to me unless it's a concerted effort to control American foreign policy, which I believe that it is.
Do you think that um, the attacks on Iran, for example, are proof of the fact that Israeli influences,
Oh,
APAC,
yeah.
other lobbyist groups might want to control American policy?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Iran is not a threat to the United States, period. I state that as fact. Iran is not a threat to the United States. The Iranians don't have weapons to attack the United States, and even if they had weapons, they don't have delivery systems to attack the United States. They're a threat to Israel. Why? Because Israel's a threat to them. Somebody said something to me the other day, and it was so simple and it made such sense. Why are we not talking about North Korea right now? I can tell you why. Because North Korea has a nuclear weapon. So nobody's going to attack North Korea because they don't want North Korea to attack them. That's why the Iranians have sought a nuclear weapon. Well, I mean, the CIA says that they actually haven't sought a nuclear weapon, but were they to seek one, it's to protect themselves against the Israelis. The Israelis who have dozens, apparently, dozens of nuclear weapons.
And in terms of the intelligence cooperation between the US and Israel, how deep does this go?
That I probably shouldn't comment on.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm. Um, so if this is something you can't comment on as well, then I can cut it from the interview or whatever. But in the case of October the 7th, do you see it as an intelligence breakdown or political complacency or something else? I mean, I know we have the Hannibal Directive, but what would you say about this?
I'm of two minds about October 7th. On the one hand, it was clear for 2 or 3 weeks in advance of the attack that something was afoot. There were settlers who were warning Jerusalem that an attack was coming. But these two morons, ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who are in charge of security, apparently say they believed that the attack was going to come in the West Bank, not in Gaza. And that's why they were unprepared. That's one side of the story. The other side, and I think there's probably something to this, was this attack on October 7th gave the Israeli government the green light to utterly destroy Gaza, destroy it. There are probably 200,000 people dead. Officially, there are 69,000. We have no idea how many dead remain under the rubble, just as skeletons now. But I think that was the whole plan, was to completely destroy Gaza and to throw out literally all of the Palestinians so that the whole area could be resettled with Israelis.
And do you think there's any way of Hamas and the Israeli government coming to a proper, effective ceasefire or a peace plan or a two-state solution, or do you think that the Israelis
No,
just aren't interested in that?
no. Benjamin Netanyahu very proudly said the other day that he killed the two-state solution. There is no two-state solution. It's
Mhm.
gone. And it's gone because he killed it. So no, Hamas is, a handful of guys with long beards. The Israelis are murdering civilians, women, children, the elderly, the sick. And you can't have as a viable policy to just kill everybody. The Israelis, of all people in the world, should know something like that. And so I don't think there's any chance of a true ceasefire. I don't think there's any chance of a real peace. Look, when the Israelis continue to bomb the Palestinian negotiating team while they're in other countries, there won't be any peace. No.
Mhm. And do you think, in terms of the political influence that Israel has in the US, do you think that there's any way to mitigate this or try and reverse this, or do you think it's just too embedded into every area of
Well,
US politics?
it's a combination of being embedded and also of senior policymakers not having any problem with it. Donald Trump has no problem with the Israelis running US foreign policy. And Joe Biden also didn't have a problem with that.
Hmm.
No. And Barack Obama and George W. Bush, and they all just accept that Benjamin Netanyahu is going to run American foreign policy.
I mean, I think this will lead on to some of my next questions, but do you think that there's a reason for this beyond the common claim that Israel is our greatest ally and Israel is a
Yeah,
point
it's
of
money.
strength in the Middle East?
Sure, it's money. It's money.
Hmm.
If you are not 1000% pro-Israeli, if you are not an ardent Zionist, they will spend millions of dollars to defeat you in an election. And more often than not, they're successful. So if
Yeah.
you have any hopes for a political career in the United States, you have to be ardently and publicly Zionist.
Okay. Okay. And I'm going to move on now to some points of controversy, some points of recent controversy. First, the Epstein files. I saw you discuss this in a podcast that was released 3 days ago. In terms of Epstein himself, I've heard you say that you think or know or think certainly that he was murdered. Can you
No,
explain?
I've been adamant from the beginning. I do not think he was murdered.
Oh,
No,
okay. Okay.
no. I believe he committed suicide.
Okay. Okay. And in terms of him being the claims that are increasingly emerging about him being an intelligence asset, what are your
That's another thing that I've been very consistent over. I have said from the very beginning that I believed he was an Israeli access agent, and that's been borne out. And
Mhm.
not only was he an Israeli access agent, he appears to have at least volunteered to work with CIA, FBI, MI5, MI6, the Germans. He reached out repeatedly to the Russians. So, yeah, I think he was probably an intelligence broker, but I believe he was under the control of the Israelis.
How exactly does this, I mean, I don't know how much you can go into here, but how does the process of attaining and utilizing an intelligence asset like this work?
We would need half a day to talk about it, but an access agent, the Israelis are not going to recruit Bill Clinton or Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. So they do the next best thing. They recruit somebody who's close to those people, like Jeffrey Epstein. And you give him plenty of money, and he buys this giant house on a private island, and he wires every single room, including the bathrooms, for audio and video. And then you invite your friends to come and have sex with children and to get them into compromising positions. You record everything that they say, you report it back to your handlers, and just in case they object, well, you've got this video putting them in these compromising positions.
Do you think that this leverage, I suppose, is another reason why Western states are so cautious to criticize Israel?
Probably not.
Okay.
I think really it's the money in politics.
Hmm.
Um, I think this was more of a purely intelligence operation.
Okay. Okay. And I've heard talk as well that he's got moderately strong links to the CIA.
No,
And
he no, he repeatedly volunteered to work with the CIA. There's no evidence that the CIA ever responded. And then a couple of years before his death, he had his attorney reach out to the CIA asking, through the Freedom of Information Act, to to receive some kind of confirmation that he had been trying to work with the CIA. And there was no response to that either.
okay, so there's no evidence that he actually worked with them or okay,
No.
interesting. And back to I don't want to linger on this too long, but back to the idea that he wasn't murdered and that he indeed committed suicide. I mean, there's lots of conspiracy theories and these things in this area. What makes you certain that he did commit suicide?
Because I've served in prison. I know what American prisons are like. All the guards have their heads up their asses, number one. They're supposed to walk around every 15 minutes and make sure that everybody is okay. They don't because they're in the guard booth, either sound asleep or masturbating, looking at porn, or surfing the internet, or on the phone with their girlfriends. So they don't walk around. In the case of Epstein, it was 2 hours before they walked around rather than every 8 minutes. The cameras never work. There are cameras everywhere. They're just not connected to anything. So people are like, oh my God, the camera, there's this glitch. Yeah, the camera's reset every 24 hours and they tape over the previous 24 hours. So the handful of cameras that work actually reset themselves. Um, you're looking at a guy who was going to spend the rest of his natural life in prison, period. It doesn't matter that he had his own island or the widest townhouse in Manhattan or $1 billion or fancy friends in important positions. He was going to die on a steel prison bunk after spending every day of the rest of his life in prison. Who wouldn't rather be dead?
Hmm. I suppose
So,
especially when he's come from the lifestyle that he was living before with the wealth and the
exactly right.
Mhm. Okay, okay, well that's interesting.
I
Um,
spoke with his brother
mhm.
a couple of weeks ago, right after this stupid AI generated picture came out of him just walking down the street in Tel Aviv with three bodyguards. And some of my friends in independent journalism ran with this, saying, "Oh my God, it's the proof. He lived. He escaped from the prison. It was a no, you morons. It's AI. It's obviously AI. He's not just walking down the street." So I spoke with his brother. His brother identified the body. His brother accompanied the body to the crematorium. He's dead. And we can have the argument over whether or not he committed suicide or was murdered. I believe he committed suicide, but uh, but he's dead.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll move on now to a very separate issue, which is your work for Russian media. I know you've been criticized for this
Only
before,
by
which
one
I find
person.
okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I must have just seen that one person then.
Yeah.
Why did you make the choice to go into this area of work? I've heard you say it was perhaps due to purely financial
Look,
reasons.
I am a convicted national security felon.
Hmm.
Okay? If you're aware of some job that I could have that would allow me to put my five children through college, I'm all ears.
Hmm.
But part of the plan that was enacted against me was to ruin me for life. And the only job that I could get was to have a radio show that just happened to be on a Russian network. Now, it was written into my contract that I could say anything I wanted and criticize anybody I wanted, including Vladimir Putin, which I did. On the day that Russia invaded Ukraine, I opened my show by saying, I unreservedly condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine and I urge Russian troops to withdraw immediately.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
I
what's
wasn't
what's the problem?
attacking you for
No,
your work.
I get it, but and I'm asking rhetorically. I'm not asking you
Mhm.
specifically. What's the problem?
Well, I
Because
think
God knows you can't criticize Israel on in the American media.
yes, you probably can't.
What's the difference?
Yes, yeah, I think that there's no evidence for Russian media being any more narrative driven or focused on disinformation than the UK media. And I think that
Yeah,
the attitude that the UK media, for example, takes is probably evidence that perhaps they're even more biased. So,
yeah.
okay, so
May I add one thing? The
mhm,
criticism that I worked for Russian media came from Andrew Bustamante, a very public former CIA officer who runs a
mhm,
website where he sells his training from the CIA. He takes his training that he underwent and he will teach you, CIA training. Does he train Russians? Chinese? It's my understanding he'll train anybody who pays. So what's the difference? If I have a show on a Russian network or he's training Russian intelligence officers in CIA techniques, what's
well,
he doing?
that in fact sounds more problematic.
I would think so.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Okay, well, I'll move on now to a bit more of a funny topic, I suppose, which is Area 51 and these sorts of conspiracy theories that are surrounding these sites. Do you think that there's any legitimacy to any of this and the claims that the government are hiding very, very huge secrets from the population?
Probably. I'm not sure that those secrets are held at Area 51. But yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence out there. On my first day at the CIA, I asked my new boss, "So where are the aliens?" And he laughed and he said, "That's everybody's first question on their first day." He said, "We don't do that kind of thing. That's all at the Pentagon." And now we've had, leaks recently from the Pentagon, leaks of videos. I have a lot of friends who are former fighter pilots, F-16, F-18, F-35, and literally every one of them has seen something. Some ship, sometimes they're coming out of the water, out of the ocean. Everybody has seen something that is completely inexplicable. So, I mean, there has to be something out there.
And I suppose those people would be most knowledgeable on aircraft and these things. So there's some
Right,
validity, I suppose. Yes.
right,
Okay.
right.
What do you think that the public doesn't understand? What's the biggest thing the public doesn't understand about the CIA and these sorts of organizations?
The CIA's job is very, very simple. The CIA's job is to recruit spies to steal secrets and to analyze those secrets so that the policymaker can make the best informed policy. Um, Counterterrorism, counterintelligence, yes, assassination squads, yes, but not space aliens and, alien technologies. There are offices at the Pentagon where that's all they do. Uh, it's not the CIA. The CIA is not beaming waves at your head. The CIA is not communicating with you through the filling in your tooth. The CIA doesn't give a shit about you unless you have access to classified foreign intelligence. I think those are probably the most basic and most important things that people should know about the CIA.
Okay, okay. Well, I got a few points of reflection now, if you don't mind. My first question here would be, do you regret joining the CIA in the
No,
first place?
no. Best job I ever had. Went to 72 countries, enjoyed every minute of it. I regret that after 9/11, the CIA became a criminal organization. But no, I don't regret joining.
What was your favorite country that you visited?
I, I have two answers. My favorite country in terms of just natural beauty was Oman on the southeastern corner of the Arabian Peninsula. The most fascinating country I ever visited historically was Syria, because the things that you look at as you're going through the day are mentioned in the Bible. They're so old. I really loved both of those places.
And what would you say your least favorite or the most, perhaps the most dangerous would be a better question, country that you've been to is?
Oh, I've been to some really dangerous places. I served in Pakistan. I went to Somalia. I went to Yemen 5 times. There are plenty of dangerous places out there. My least favorite place that I ever served was India. Indians are mean to one another. This caste system they have is just awful. It's racist and bigoted and it's just awful. And I've never been to a place on earth as physically dirty as as India. You just have to accept the fact that you're going to get sick there. There's nothing you can do to protect yourself. Nothing. Just accept it and then try to deal with it as best you can once you get sick.
In terms of the few countries that you mentioned being very dangerous, how dangerous were these countries? Is there any way you could quantify it for the viewers or?
Yeah, I was twice the victim of assassination attempts. I narrowly escaped car bombs twice, and one of those car bombs killed 4 dozen people and wounded hundreds. So yeah, I mean there are active attempts to murder you every day.